let me show you how we actually connect this. And it might sound complicated to build an API around these database tables, but let me show you what we do. We're now bleeding over the edge of the tutorial.
Is there a tool that actually builds an API around database model?
Like competing tools?
Yeah.
There are zillions of them. There's one, I think it's called Just API. That one's pretty cool. There are a lot that do this part of the process. Ours is the coolest, and I'll show you why. We have, basically, our APIs have a process that's sort of difficult to explain, but once you get it, you never have to actually write any code again. And basically the process is, if you were to go to Twitter or like any Facebook graph API, any API, they have these big giant documents about all the endpoints and all the parameters that come back from them. There are generators that can actually document that stuff fairly easily, but here's the deal. Our stuff doesn't actually need documentation because it applies the same rules to every endpoint at all times. We set up a DT REST provider, which basically uses a model for its backing and supports a standardized number of REST point actions. So we can do things that basically go through all the HTTP status methods. So you can do get, post, put, patch, delete. And it recognizes, basically, if you don't provide an identifier, it will apply the collection method. So for get, that means pulling the list of all wineries, for example. If I specify an ID, if I put the number 1 in that request, it assumes that I don't want the list of all wineries. I want the data for winery 1. Now, the data that comes back from winery 1 is basically going to be exactly what's generated by, not that, by this. So it's going to have the name, owner, location, and it's going to have a location list. So I'll show you when the API is working what comes back from this. It's pretty cool. But we don't, so I'll show you how to do the API. Here is how we build an API for winery data. So we go into our application. There's a file here called apis.json. Now our apps come preloaded with a couple of examples that we use to do that user listing, right? We need to make a decision. There's 2 APIs in here. One is the public access and one is the OAuth-based access. Things that I put in here require OAuth tokens to use. Things that I put up here are public facing. So let's say that we're building an app where we want the wineries to be public facing. So we're going to add our record to this provider set. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come in here. I'm going to say, all right, the endpoint, we're going to call it winery. And then we're just going to give it a model. And the model is going to be expressive winery model winery. And that's it. We just built our endpoint. What happens is when I specify a model, it creates me a generic DT REST provider, and it uses this model for its backing to do all of its actions on. We can customize this later, as we do with these, by creating a provider class and customizing the actions available. But for most things, especially just to get the app development started, this is sufficient because it provides all the methods that we need available already.
So I have a question. In the architecture side of the building this app, so like DT Relay is already in there, it's already protecting the endpoints and everything.
Mm-hmm.
So if, we just in that discussion about DTQL and DT provider, DT itself, DT Relay,
mm-hmm.
It's kind of like if someone wants to use it, they really need the whole.
You can use the pieces individually. Like we could just use DTQL to build our database and be done. We don't need DT provider.
So I was just trying to think about okay, so I'm a VB developer and I still want to use my environment, all my tools, or
mm-hmm.
a Java developer.
Yeah, you can still use DTQL in your environment. You don't have to use DT provider. You don't have to use this part I'm showing you here because actually it's a totally separate technology.
Okay.
And the same with DT Relay. It's absolutely not attached to the architecture. We use it, because it makes our life easier. And we have, basically these are standard REST endpoints, just like the ones for Facebook or Twitter. So the relay doesn't care that it's hitting DT. It doesn't even know that it's hitting DT. It's just another API. It doesn't. You can swap out whichever parts you want. For example, we want to create something like this users list, except it's going to have our winery data. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into our sites folder to Vino. We're going to go to site public, and we're going to basically just copy this user folder, and we're going to call it winery. Okay. Then we're going to open this list file. This is set up to users, so we're going to change it. We're going to say wineries. Now we want to change the service endpoint. So we put winery here, actually, yeah. And we're going to have winery fields instead of user fields. This is our front-end architecture, so it's not a part of DT, and it doesn't necessarily matter. You can use whatever you want. We use this. Winery edit. And we use it because it's insanely quick to set stuff up. So we need to do a couple of other pieces to this. We need some JavaScript backing to control what's going on here. So we're going to also create this user.js. We're going to create winery.js. Again, we're just basically going to swap out all the parts that say user, and we're going to put in winery. So do that. And then we're going to go in, I think there's one spot down here where we're going to change this to winery. We won't use most of this stuff for this, but this is just what we start with so that all of our stuff does everything all the time, if we wanted to. Now, that's actually it. We just set up the page with the listing, and we set up the controllers to make it work. But I'm going to go ahead and expose a state so that we can visit a URL to get there. And for that, I'm going to, again, just take the user stuff, which is our sample code, and I'm going to change the word user to winery. I'm going to replace these individually so I don't wipe out my user stuff. Okay, so now these are all hooked up. I actually don't want this to be protected because, as we mentioned, our winery endpoint is public, so we don't need people to log in to get there. So that's our listing, that's our state. The last thing I'm going to do, well, that's fine. I was going to add a navigation item, but we don't necessarily need it. So I'm going to go to our site, and because we changed the JavaScript, I need to rebuild this, right? So I'm going to run Webpack again. All right, so Webpack ran. We usually just keep Webpack watching that folder in the background so it automatically recompiles whenever we change something. Oh, I forgot one step. We need to go into one more place. In order for our site to use the relay to hit this endpoint, there's another layer of mapping which is specific to the application. And the reason that we do this is so that we can have developers on the front end build the application, and we can have a guy in the back end. When our database guy comes in and he looks at the work that the front end guys did, he's like, oh man, this is not efficient at all. This is terrible. We need a database that is designed for record storage, not for application development, right? This is the touch point. This is where this conflict happens. Because we have a number of mapping layers between the front end and the back end guy can optimize the data structures and everything about them without even affecting the front end application. All right, so there's a file in the site that actually defines all the endpoints. It takes a provider, a service in Angular, and hooks it up to one of our endpoints. So we're gonna just go in here, we're gonna say, okay, hook me up to a winery, like that. This name right here matches the endpoint that we put in this file. I'm gonna save this real quick in this file. So as long as this name matches the one in the site, we've connected all the dots. I want to actually get the data to show up. So I'm gonna go back to the wineries JS file, which is somewhere in here. So there's a little listing we have right here, and this is my winery fields. So I'm going to change this to, let's say, name, and then I'm going to do one of these for structure that I won't really go into, but basically it's our mapping to the owner, let's say, and this is going to be that, and then we can do location, full street address, for example, and we're going to give that a label of location. Okay, by doing this, refreshing, well, I gotta be running Webpack. Ta-da! And it all comes sortable, so we can click this and sort one way or the other. And yeah, that's pretty much all of our data. So this is our data in an app. No code written, really.